Churches have forgotten all about science, and it shows in our Christian worldview. Welcome to the Pastor's Voice. I am Reuel Sample, and I talk to pastors and other Christian leaders about ways we can encourage Christian worldview to the glory and honor of Jesus Christ. We kick off our 2023 season by talking to Dr. Fazale Rana, President, CEO, and Senior Scholar of Reasons to Believe, an organization dedicated to communicating the powerful case for God's existence and the Bible's reliability to both Christians and non-Christians. Fuzz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Reuel, for having me.
I like that last part when we talk about the Bible's reliability to both Christians and non-Christians. Basically what you're saying is that the Bible is true whether you believe it or not.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, it's, remarkable to me, really, how powerful the scientific evidence is for a creator, but equally powerful is the fact that the creation accounts in Scripture hold up to scientific scrutiny, and that really, sets in place, I think, a framework to view the Bible as being, completely reliable.
Well, we're going to talk a lot about science tonight, and it's important to establish your credentials right off the bat. So first, let's talk about your scientific background. You're not just a Joe coming off the street.
Yeah, well, I guess not. I'm a biochemist by training, and so I did a PhD in chemistry with an emphasis in biochemistry from Ohio University, and then I did a couple of postdoctoral stints, one at the University of Virginia, one at the University of Georgia. And then after that, I worked for not quite a decade in research and development for a Fortune 500 company before joining Reasons to Believe about 23 years ago now. So I've cut my teeth in the scientific arena for certain.
Now let's talk about your faith background as well. You weren't always a Christian.
No, I wasn't. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. In fact, my father was a devout Muslim. He was also a nuclear physicist, so he was a man of science, but also a man of faith, and again, a devout Muslim. And growing up, my brother and I, of course, were then exposed to Islam. And as a teenager, I took the idea of becoming a Muslim pretty seriously. And so I recited the Shahada, which is the declaration that Allah is the one true God and Muhammad is his one true prophet. And my father taught me how to pray, and I began to read from English translations of the Quran. And so it was going through that process for a year and a half, almost 2 years, before I kind of abandoned all faith altogether and settled into a position of, maybe agnosticism, for lack of a better description. And as I was studying chemistry and biology in college, embraced kind of an evolutionary worldview where I would have argued that the origin and the design and the history of life could be explained exclusively through evolutionary processes. And that fueled my agnosticism. It justified my agnosticism because, hey, if evolution can explain everything in biology, then what role is there for a creator to play?
That's interesting. You're coming from a Muslim background. We talk about that in Christian circles, that Christians go to college and they fall away from the faith. But it sounds like almost an attack on all faiths when you go to university.
Yeah, and by the time that I had finished up high school, even before I entered into college, I already was becoming, I would say, maybe bored with pursuing religion. I was a young man,
Mm-hmm.
and sports and rock music and girls were far more interesting to me than the rote and the ritual of being a Muslim, right? Because a lot of what you do as a Muslim is really out of obligation to try to please Allah. And that soon lost interest to me in light of everything else that I could spend my time. But then it was really going into college that kind of solidified that position of uncertainty about whether God exists because of the way that I was interpreting what I was learning in my science classes.
But you found your way back to faith, but not necessarily the faith of your family.
Yes, yes, it was. In graduate school, studying biochemistry, really beginning to examine the intricacies of the cell. And I was astounded at not only the complexity of biochemical systems, but their elegance and their sophistication, the ingenuity of these systems. And that really prompted me to ask the question, well, where do these systems come from? And the scientific explanation is called the origin of life. This is the origin of life question. And as I examined in detail the different explanations for the origin of life, I quickly reached the conclusion that there was no way that chemistry and physics alone could produce these kind of elegant systems, that there had to be a mind behind everything. And so while science on one hand took away, science later gave back to me this conviction that there really is a mind behind life itself. And that, of course, then led me to ask the question, well, who is this creator? Do I relate to that creator? And if so, how?
So those are questions and thoughts that not only Christians wrestle with, but Islam as well. Mm-hmm. So what led you to Christianity in particular?
Yeah, well, once I became convinced that there was a creator, and then asked the question, who is that creator? As I reflected on it, I was going down a path of universalism, where I thought, well, maybe the different religions of the world were just simply the different ways that this creator was revealing himself to different people, to different people groups. And as I looked at the religions of the world, they seemed to me to all share a common moral teaching. And so I thought, well, this makes sense. Now, in retrospect, that position of universalism was really naive, because I now appreciate that the different religions of the world do teach very different things about the nature of reality, the nature of God. And so in light of that, they all can't be true. Either none of them are true or one is true, but they all can't be true. But that was the position that I was beginning to assume. And along the way, the woman that I was engaged to rededicated her life to Christ. She grew up in a Christian home. She kind of wouldn't say walked away from her faith, but just kind of fell away from her faith, and then rededicated her life to Christ. And she began to share her faith with me. And as we were preparing to be married, her pastor, a guy by the name of Johnny Withrow, met me, and he asked me this question: have you ever read the Bible? And my answer was no. Then he said, well, how do you know it's not true? And I felt like, well, that's a really good point.
He laid it down.
And my wife, was a Christian. And so I thought at least I owe it to her to understand what Christianity is about. Mm-hmm. And it was really reading the Gospel of Matthew, and specifically the Sermon on the Mount, that led me to an encounter with the person of Christ. And I would argue it was a religious experience. As I was reading through the Sermon on the Mount, I was very much attracted to the person of Christ. I felt that what he was teaching about authentic righteousness was true, but I knew that I couldn't live up to that standard. And as I was going through that reasoning process, I was actually in a chemistry lab. It was in the evening. Nobody else was around. I was sitting at a lab bench reading the Bible, and I had this overwhelming sense that there was a person in the room with me. And it was at that point I just had this, again, overarching sense that Christianity is true, that Jesus is who Christians claim him to be. And that then led me to seeking after Christ, and to acknowledging his work on the cross as the means by which I was saved. So it was, God revealed through the record of nature, but it was the person of Christ revealed not only through the pages of Scripture, but really through this divine encounter that I had.
Interesting. You're seeking a reason for all these scientific things. Then you start understanding there had to be a mind behind it. Then you start seeking out all the gods of the world, and then through your wife you understand the necessity of this God. But all that reasoning gets superseded by a personal encounter with Jesus Christ.
Yeah. I mean, to this very day, I could never abandon my faith as a Christian, not because of the evidence that I see for the Christian faith, and there's an abundance of evidence, but it's because of that experience that I had. It was such a real, powerful experience that I could never deny that Christianity is not true, or that I could never deny that Christianity is true.
Well, let's talk about 2 or 3 things that point to a creator. 2 or 3 things that our listeners can say, well, that makes sense.
Well, I think about the evidence from the perspective of a biochemist. And, the first thing that I would say is that the elegant designs that we see in biology, even the most staunch atheist would acknowledge that biological systems have the appearance of design. Richard Dawkins, in his famous book, The Blind Watchmaker, says biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. And so, he would agree, with me that there is that appearance of design. But to me, I think that design is authentic design. And, the more that we learn about biochemical systems, the more marvelous those systems become. And in fact, one of the things I find fascinating is there seems to be this interplay between the technologies that we invent and the nature of biological and biochemical systems. And so what I mean by that is that to really fully understand how biochemical systems are structured, how they operate, many times we have to look at them through the lens of human technology, and then we suddenly get the insight as to what's going on. And by the same token, the more that we learn about biochemical systems, the more insight that we gain that actually leads to the development of new technologies. And let me just give you what I think to be an example that blows my mind. That this is the type of thing that keeps me awake at night as I think about the implications. But everybody I think is familiar with the idea of DNA, right? DNA is this double helical molecule, and it consists of 2 molecular strands that are formed by linking together these smaller molecules. So it's kind of like the links in a chain. And there are 4 different molecules that are used to build DNA that are abbreviated A, G, C, and T. They're called the genetic letters. And it's actually the sequence of those genetic letters, just like the sequence of letters that are used to make up words in the English language, in which there's information that's contained. And that information is used to build the cell and to direct the operation of the cellular components. Well, that information in DNA is digital information, just like the digital information that we use in our electronic devices. And the cell's machinery that manipulates DNA, let's say when DNA is replicated or the information is read to build proteins, the machinery that does that is literally operating like a computer system. And in fact, the similarity is so stark that it actually has inspired a new area of nanotechnology called DNA computing, where scientists are now looking to build computers from DNA and the molecules inside the cell that operate on DNA, that manipulate DNA. And these are wet computers. They are found in solution in a little tiny test tube that's about this big, and it's more powerful than the most powerful silicon-based computer system that we've ever built. And there's a number of technical reasons why that's the case. Uh, but the point here is that to really understand what DNA is doing and how DNA is operating in the cell, we need to look at it through the lens of computer science. And
Interesting.
then once we do that, that then gives us an insight that allows us to build a new technology, to develop a new technology. And so it's really eerie to me that there's that interplay between between the technology we build and the structure and the function of biochemical systems. And to me, that finds explanation if, number one, those systems are designed by a mind, but two, it makes sense if we think that as human beings were made in God's image, because if we're made in God's image and God is a creator, then we too are creators ourselves. And doesn't it make sense that if we are image bearers, that what we do is unwittingly identical to what the creator has already done within the creation? And and the more that we discover about biochemistry, the more and more examples of this type of interplay that we see. And so it's extremely provocative. DNA is an amazing molecule in many respects. But as I mentioned, it's a data. It stores information that's digital information. DNA is so optimized to store digital information that it may actually be at the theoretical maximum in terms of the information that you could store per unit amount of material, that people are actually looking at using DNA as a data storage medium. And so instead of hard disks or magnetic tapes, people are looking at actually storing data in the DNA molecule. This is known as DNA data storage, and it's becoming, again, a burgeoning nanotechnology that literally is going to probably revolutionize, again, how we operate doing computations. But it very well may be that one day in the future, we're working with computer systems that are essentially entirely made up of DNA.
So I knew my DNA was good for something. I'll have to. Now the intelligent design folks talk about irreducible complexity when they talk about things like the eyeball. That there's no way something like that could have come into existence through evolution. Does the same thing apply to DNA?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the Origin of Life research program, there's something known as the chicken and egg paradox, and this has to do with DNA, because even though people talk about DNA as being a self-replicating molecule, it technically is not. DNA can only replicate if you have proteins that really are carrying out that replication process. But the proteins that replicate DNA are essentially the information needed to make them is stored in the DNA molecule. And so there's this interdependency between DNA and proteins. And so you can't get DNA if you don't have proteins to replicate it, but you can't get the proteins to replicate DNA unless you have DNA. And so it's a type of irreducible complexity. It's a chicken and egg problem, or a chicken and egg system that's kind of like a type of irreducible complexity. And so this is really, is considered to be a significant problem. And the only workaround that Origin of Life researchers have is to argue that maybe the very first life forms were built around something called an RNA molecules, not DNA and protein, and that later life evolved to give rise to DNA and protein from an RNA world, as it's called. But the problem is that most Origin of Life researchers readily acknowledge that the RNA world hypothesis is, again, a failed model. In fact, Leslie Orgel, who was an Origin of Life researcher who conceived of the idea of the RNA world, later on in his lifetime, before he died, basically went on record as saying it would be a miracle if a strand of RNA could ever appear on the primitive Earth. And so,
When you get into miracles, now you're getting into areas that they
right,
don't really want to talk about.
right. Well, and Orgel was an outspoken atheist, but he was also very honest, and was in a sense, pointing out that the problems with the RNA world are legion, and so you have this chicken and egg paradox. You have the problems with the RNA world. There's really no way to explain how DNA comes about, and again, DNA is not a molecule that's just thrown together by chance and happenstance. It's an incredibly optimized, incredibly elegant molecule where every you know every aspect of its structural makeup is vitally critical to its function. So much so that it's hard to envision any kind of other material that could ever operate like DNA. DNA is not only optimized, it really appears to be unique and uniquely fit for its role. And so the evidence for design is just overwhelming when you look at DNA and all the processes that DNA is involved in inside the cell.
If you're just listening to the podcast and not seeing the video, you need to understand that every time Fuzz talks about the elegance of DNA, his eyes light up like he's looking at a fine piece of art. But in your eyes, it is a fine piece of art. There's that elegance there that is beautiful to the scientist who can understand it.
It is. Well, I mean, one of the things that as a young college student that really attracted me to biochemistry is the sheer beauty of the molecular realm, and particularly the biochemical realm. These biomolecules are, as you said, works of art. They have these beautiful structures, this beautiful symmetry that defines these molecules. They are just simply, something to behold. And so, yeah, I see, beauty, and that again, I think points to a creator, because no matter where we look in nature, whether it's looking up into the night sky and seeing the grandeur of the cosmos, or looking at a sunset, or peering into an electron microscope to look at the molecules that make up living systems, there's just this incredible beauty. And if we live in a universe that is the product of a creator, we would expect it to be a beautiful universe. Scripture tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God, that God's glory and majesty is evident in the creation, and we definitely see that in the beauty of creation. But what's even more remarkable is that as human beings, we have this deep appreciation of the beauty of the world around us. And that makes sense if and only if we are made in God's image. We're made to appreciate the beauty of the creation that God has put in place. If we're the product of evolution, or if the universe is just a brute reality, why would it be beautiful? And why would we have an appreciation for beauty? Beauty really serves no useful purpose in an evolutionary sense. It would be a distraction from our survivability. And so even when we think about the beauty of the world around us, that leads us, to the reality of a creator.
Evolution focuses on function. A creator focuses on both function and beauty, and all the things that go into it. Let's bring this back to the church, because we do talk about worldview, and I love the church, and I think in many ways the church of any denomination has let its believers, its members, its believers down. Because on one side they come to church, their kids play with the felt boards. You have to be my age to remember felt boards in church, and they listen to all the stories, and they say, oh yeah, the Bible is true, but then they go out into the academic world, into the real world, or whatever, and they have to live a double mind. How do we in our churches get the idea that science does not overrule faith, and neither does it have to be separate from faith, but it can be a vital part of our faith? How do we do that?
Yeah, well, and I think the first place to begin is to realize that, Scripture tells us that that God has revealed himself to us. And of course, most people understand that the words of Scripture is the way in which God has revealed himself to us, the person of Christ. If we see Jesus, we've seen God. But, Scripture also tells us that God has made himself known to us through the record of nature. And it's not just simply that we see God's fingerprints in creation, but we even, according to Scripture, can begin to discern something about God's character and nature. His majesty, his glory, his righteousness, his love. The Scripture tells us that this is all evident to us within the creation. And so science is the study of the creation. And so we would expect that science should reveal to us, again, evidence for God's existence and evidence for God's nature and character. And so by studying science, it really it should lead us to a place of worship. It's, God spoke the world into existence. And so we could think about the creation as God's spoken word to us, whereas Scripture is God's, written word to us. And of course, Jesus is the living word, right? And so each of these three are elements of God's revelation to us. So that's the first thing that I would say, and if God is the author ultimately of the record of nature, of the world that we live in, and he's also the author ultimately of Scripture, we would expect that those two accounts should never fundamentally disagree with each other. Now, we might interpret Scripture wrongly, or we might interpret the record of nature wrongly, and there could be perceived conflict because of the misinterpretations. But fundamentally, these two accounts should always be in agreement with each other. And so, to me, science is a mechanism by which we can really appreciate and understand and gain insight into God in a unique and fresh way if we think about science in those terms.
Two questions for you. We've got two different folks that I hope are listening. The one are Christians who have kids or who have other folks who are scientists or who say, well, I think for a living, so I'm not going to waste my time on faith. First question is, how should they talk to that? How should Christians engage with that kind of mindset?
Well, I think, there's this mischaracterization of what faith is all about. Faith isn't just simply blind, hopeful belief in something, but it actually is looking at the evidence and then operating on the basis of what that evidence is telling us. And so where we're exercising our faith really is not so much in whether or not God exists, but really our faith is being exercised in, do we trust in the person in the work of Christ on the cross for our salvation? But when you look at Scripture, there are many places where God is clearly indicating that He is providing evidence for his existence, for the reality of what is being communicated in Scripture. I love the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, right? Because Jesus asked Mary, "I'm the resurrection. Do you believe that?" And she says yes. And then what does he do? He raises Lazarus from the dead, and so he's providing evidence for what he just claimed through that action. And so faith isn't irrational. It's not based on an absence of evidence, but it really is, I think, motivated by evidence and reason. And so for somebody like that, I think it's very important to get that point across, that there is evidence for the Christian faith, and it's completely reasonable.
God himself, I think it was in Jeremiah, says, "Come, let us reason together." God is not above logical reasoning, logical discovery. So the second question is that I'm a pastor. I have an undergraduate degree in business and sociology. I have a master's degree in divinity. I know ancient languages, and I can take apart the Bible and put it back together all day long. But I don't know anything about science. So how should pastors bring the idea of merging science into faith in their congregations? How can they go about doing that to strengthen the worldview of their members?
Yeah, and I think my advice to pastors would be, you don't necessarily have to become an expert in science, but I'm willing to bet that you probably have people in your congregation who are scientists or who are scientifically oriented. And those would be wonderful people to involve in ministry, as kind of the that community's scientific expert, and involve them in worship. I mean, what would be anything? I mean, I can't. You can envision somebody showing people the incredible images that are coming from the James Webb Telescope, right? And then as you show people that, just encourage them to begin to contemplate, what is this telling us about who God is, right? And looking at the passages of Scripture that describe the heavens declaring the glory of God, or the majesty of God. But in other words, introduce the congregation to science in a way that isn't threatening to them, but rather where science is really reinforcing and encouraging and motivating their faith. And that would be the first thing to do. And then I think it's probably important to try to as much as possible weave here and there bits and pieces of scientific evidence for the Christian faith, to show people how scientific discoveries seemingly affirm the truth of Scripture and the reality of God's existence. It doesn't have to be a long lecture, but just even introducing tidbits here and there could be incredibly helpful in terms of just getting people motivated about science. I remember attending a small church a few years ago, and was asked to speak, and I did a talk about the magnitude of the universe, how big the universe is, and to think that God brought all of this into existence, and what does that tell us about how great God is. And there was a person in the congregation who was had a high school education, was a tradesman, and the following week he comes up to me and he talks to me about an article that he read in Discover magazine about dark matter or something like that. So suddenly, by showing this person how science actually helps him to get a better grasp of God, it ignited in him an interest in science, so that he was now out reading popular science pieces where he probably wouldn't have read them before. And he was beginning to ask questions and beginning to wonder. And so those are the types of things that I think we can do in churches. It doesn't have to be this deep discourse into into these highly obscure scientific ideas, but just simply introducing to people just the beauty of the creation, and little tidbits here and there about what this tells us about God can ignite, I think, a fascination where now science isn't a threat to their faith, but it's that science is something that augments their faith in powerful ways.
Or if pastors just even want to go overboard and spend a lot of time on science in their congregations, they shouldn't be afraid of it, because it's not going to disprove. It's actually going to do just the opposite. Right. It's going to prove the glory of God and the existence of God.
Yeah.
There's a ton of stuff that you and I can keep talking about, but you cover a lot of these things over at Reasons to Believe. Tell us a little bit more about Reasons to Believe.
Yeah, well, Reasons to Believe is an organization that's been around, 36, 37 years now, in which our focus is to explore the relationship between science and the Christian faith. And our motivation for doing this is ultimately to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. And so we produce a number of resources, blog articles, podcasts, videos. We write books, and the list goes on, where we just simply, explore the science faith arena, where again the eye is towards really evangelism. We're not interested in apologetics for the sake of developing arguments, but we really want people to see again the reality of God through science, where science becomes a bridge to the gospel. We live in a world today where increasingly it's secular. People have a lot of respect for science and for the technology that comes from science, and so it becomes a very powerful bridge to the Christian faith. People may not want to talk to you much about spiritual matters initially, but they will talk to you about the latest discoveries in science. But if you can then use that as a springboard to open up more spiritual conversations, it's a very powerful tool to introduce people to the Christian faith, and then hopefully to the gospel itself.
I like that, because far too often Christians are trained, either on purpose or accidentally, to just throw truth bombs out there, and you can't believe because of this, or this. But what Reasons to Believe and what you are teaching is engagement, and then through that engagement, through whatever principles that you're talking, then they come to realize, just like you did, the saving power of Jesus Christ. So, yes. Doctor, I'm going to get this wrong, so forgive me, Dr. Fazale, Rana, Fuzz.
Yeah.
From Reasons to Believe, and what the website is?
Reasons.org.
Reasons.org. Boy, you got that early, didn't you?
Yeah.
And how can they get in touch with you? Just go to the website.
Go to the website, or I have social media, Facebook, Twitter. People can look me up on social media and interact with me there as well.
I so do appreciate you, Fuzz, for being here. Thanks for being here, and all the best with you, and all the best with Reasons to Believe.
Yeah, thanks for having me.